although the numerical work we do isn't going to seem to be connected directly to this, we need to keep sort of foremost in our minds that the null hypothesis, what the big picture is that we're testing with ANOVA, is something about the means of a bunch of different populations. And that specific hypothesis is that these means of all these groups are equal to each other. And so A here for Montgomery and Runger is our number of groups, or you could say number of levels. You'll see in other texts that this is sometimes used a symbol with K. Right, now the thing we also have to be careful about is if we decide to reject our null hypothesis, we have to be very careful about what the alternative hypothesis is. And what's tempting to say is, oh well, if this I'm rejecting the statement, then I'm rejecting that any of them are equal. That means they're all not equal, and that's not true at all necessarily. All it means is that at least two are not equal. And we'll have to do more to figure out which one of those that might be. Now, in terms of an operating rule, then we're going to reject our null hypothesis if our test statistic is greater than a threshold. And it turns out that we're going to be looking at the ratio of variances, and that's going to be the F distribution. And I've written it as though it's a one-sided. It just turns out that we actually do it two-sided, but because we're really out there close to one tail, I'm going to just write it as a one-sided for now. Right. Again, I want to emphasize here that the hypothesis is about the means, but the test statistic is related to the variances. Now, another sort of oddity about this is the assumption that we have about these variances, and that is that in these populations 1 through A, that these variances are all equal to each other. Now that seems odd, right? Because, wait a minute, I thought we were going to use a test statistic to determine that about the variances, and those will be different. Wait, what? Well, that's exactly it, though, right? The assumption is that, in a sense, these are all going to be the same, and if if we have evidence that suggests they're not, then that's going to back into us about this null hypothesis, right? So, trust me, I don't work for the government. That somehow that all works out. That's not very nice to government workers, is it? It's not the worker, it's the government. Oh, we don't need any politics going on here. All right, just having a little fun. All right, so in general here, our assumption is that the variance for group I is equal to the variance for group J for all combinations of I and J. All right, now as we approach this and start to get into this, just like when we were working with statistical quality control and we broke down variation into two groups, we're going to do the same thing here, and that is variation within a group versus variation between groups. And how we're going to think about that is that here's one particular group, and this is the lumber example I was talking about before. We have second growth Douglas fir, and we have 3 different grades of that particular species. And so we've collected sample data from a series of tests on the stiffness associated with bending, right? And this is the modulus elasticity associated with that particular one. And so our variation right here is our variation within the group. And likewise, in our second group, we got variation within the group. And of course, we measure that with the sample variance in each case. I've drawn it all the way around, but that looks more like a range. But so we have 3 different sample sample variances. Right now, of course, along with this, we could also come along and say, well, where's the sample mean for each group? So it turns out this one, the sample mean is about there, and this one, the sample mean is real close to about, actually it's a little bit down further. So there's your x bar 2, and this one's down even further, and there's your x bar 3. And if we draw horizontal lines for each of those off to the side, then that helps to illustrate our second type of variance, which, if you think about if we were pooling all of the data, you might say, oh, well, you've got a spread that goes all the way around here. But what we're really going to be after here in this between group variation is that we've got then variation between the groups of the means, that is, of the sample means of each. Right? And we'll talk about pooling all that, or having a grand mean that's associated with all that here in just a difference. But the basic idea is that we've got variation within the group, and then we've got this variation between the sample means. And the more these are closer to each other, then, that goes back to our primary hypothesis, right? That the null hypothesis, that all the population means are the same. And so the thing is we got this variation within the group. So does the variation within these samples cause the sample means to be so varied, or is there something else at work? Right? So you've got to parse out these two different kinds of things, and we're going to do this in a fairly straightforward manner in terms of calculations here in a second. But the test statistic that we're going to look at is going to be the between samples or between groups variation divided by the within group variation. And that'll turn out to be distributed according to the F distribution, because we'll be looking at mean squares over mean squares. So basically variances divided by variances, so a variance ratio.